This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. There's nothing sweeter than baking cookies during the holidays. With Prime, I get all my ingredients delivered right to my door, fast and free, no last-minute store trips needed. And of course, I blast my favorite holiday playlist on Amazon Music. It's the ultimate soundtrack for creating unforgettable memories. From streaming to shopping, it's on Prime. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to get more out of whatever you're into.
This episode is brought to you by Allstate. Some people just know they could save hundreds on car insurance by checking Allstate first. Like you know to check the date of the big game first before you accidentally buy tickets on your 20th wedding anniversary and have to spend the next 20 years of your marriage making up for it. Yeah, checking first is smart. So check Allstate first for a quote that could save you hundreds. You're in good hands with Allstate. Savings vary. Terms apply. Allstate Fire and Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Northbrook, Illinois.
This podcast is part of E2C Network, where we share the whole Auburn experience.
Hello and welcome to War Horses, the only college equestrian podcast that is just about ready for the holiday season. I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Let's talk about some college equestrian. So, we only had one meet to talk about this past week, so let's get right into our meet recap. All right, this was a single discipline meet. This was the last one of the fall. This is the one we had been waiting on so we could say, hey, we've gone through the entire fall. Berry College headed over to Swanee. These two had faced each other a couple of weeks back, and Swanee won that. So we kind of thought Swanee was going to win, especially because this was at home. I think I picked this one to be about 4-3 in favor of Swanee. Let's see how things went. In fences, that went 4-0 for Swanee. So right there, boy, they jumped all over them. And then in the flat, they did almost as well. They got Swanee won that one 3-1. That made the final score 7-1 in favor of Swanee. So yeah, this is kind of what we expected, maybe a little bit better than expected. Swanee finishes the fall with a nice home win here. This is going to keep them from continuing to drop down any further in the rankings. So they have stopped the fall. Good job, Tigers. For Berry, they didn't ride as well on the road as they did a few weeks back at home. That's kind of to be expected. Most teams do that, so nothing really to be ashamed of there. They probably would have done better, wanted to do better, but everybody always wants to do a little bit better, so nothing to be ashamed of, Vikings. Y'all did okay. So that, like I said, was the last equestrian meet of the season. So now that we've done that, let's take an extensive look at the official Auburn Elvis College Equestrian Rankings. So we're only going to do the single discipline teams, just like we did the dual discipline teams last week. I'm going to go through them in order of my rankings, and then I'm going to go and take you through how their fall went. So let's start off with number 1, Dartmouth. The Green began their season ranked 4th in my rankings and 5th in the NCEA rankings. It took them a few weeks to get going, but once they did, they hit the ground running. They beat Swanee at home back when Swanee was riding pretty well. Then they beat Sacred Heart on the road. Then they won a pair of home meets against Charleston and Sacred Heart. Dartmouth is the only remaining undefeated team, but their spring schedule will be much rougher for them. They have to go to Charleston, then they go to Texas A&M, and then they host UC Davis. So I'm thinking that they might go 2-1, or maybe 1-2, or even 0-3 in that stretch. It would have been really nice if Dartmouth had ridden against either Sweetbriar or Lynchburg this year, because it's kind of difficult to know how they would do, because they only have like one common opponent, and it's really tough to tell, especially when you don't have a lot of meets to look at. You don't have a lot of data, but we do have that Charleston road meet coming up in the spring, and so we'll look forward to that in February, and that'll tell us a little bit more about how Dartmouth compares to other teams. But right now, we don't have a lot to go on, but they are undefeated, so they're going to stay number 1. And I'll actually go ahead and predict that Dartmouth is they're going to end up somewhere in the top 3. The NCEA voters, they really like the Green. So even if they lose all those meets and go 0-3 in the spring, I bet they're still going to get ranked above Charleston. So they'll probably be in that top 3. The number 2 team is Sweetbriar. Again, this is my rankings, not the NCEA rankings, so that's why I have the Vixens at number 2, because I know what I'm talking about. The Vixens began the season ranked at number 2 in both my rankings and the NCEA rankings, but once the season began, the Vixens began by beating Swanee on the road, and then they handled a red-hot Charleston team their first loss of the season. Then they went over to Lynchburg and they lost to the Hornets, and then they went over to South Carolina and they picked up a loss there as well. Now, looking ahead, I expect the Vixens to go undefeated the rest of the way. That would have them ending the regular season at either number 1 or number 2, depending on how much Dartmouth gets penalized for any losses that they pick up. The only team that the NCAA rankings people like more than Dartmouth is Sweetbriar, so I'm going to say in the end, they're probably going to end up ranked number 1 at the end of the regular season. The number 3 team is Lynchburg. The Hornets began the season number 1 in both rankings, but they stumbled a bit out of the gate. They lost at home to Charleston, but they just walloped Centenary at home the next day. Then they turned around and lost at Swanee, but they got their mojo back with a pair of home meets, beating Bridgewater and then Sweetbriar. They finished up the fall with a close tiebreaker win at Centenary to bring their record up to 4-2. The Hornets have not listed any spring meets on their website, so other than the road meet that we know they're going to face Sweetbriar, we have to assume that they're probably going to lose that one, and they're probably going to stay above Charleston in the rankings since, as I mentioned, the NCAA rankings people aren't big fans of the Cougars. So I'm just going to say that the Hornets end up the regular season at number 3. Maybe number 2, but probably number 3. And if you don't like that Lynchburg, well, update your dang website and then go over to the NCAA website and put your meets over there too while you're at it. All right, number 4 is Charleston. The Cougars began the season ranked 8th in my rankings and unranked in the NCEA rankings, but they quickly took the college equestrian world by storm, beating Centenary at a neutral site and then upsetting host Lynchburg. And for a couple of weeks, the Cougars were on top of the world, looking down on creation, smiling. Then they lost at Sweetbriar, at Dartmouth, and at Sacred Heart to finish the spring 2-3. Now, looking ahead, the spring sets up very nicely for the Cougars. They have all home meets from here on out, and then they even host their conference tournament. So they have a real chance to impress here. I think they're going to end up at least number 4 at the end of the season, and maybe they might be able to creep up into number 2 or number 3 if everything breaks just right for them. And this is going to be a pretty successful regular season for them regardless of how the postseason goes. Okay, now I want to mention again that those single discipline teams, they're all in the top 4. If the national championship tournament were starting today, then all 4 of those teams would probably be invited. But here's the rest of the field that needs to shake things up if they want to pop up into that top 4. Number 5 is Sacred Heart. The Pioneers began the season ranked 5th in my rankings and 3rd in the NCEA ranking. They started things off with a home loss to Dartmouth, then beat Charleston at home, and then went on the road and lost in a tiebreaker to Dartmouth. It wasn't an extensive resume, but it's one that could have easily been 3-0 for them. Now, looking ahead, they have to make a road trip to Charleston that is going to be tough for them. I feel like the Pioneers will probably finish the regular season 5th or 6th, but they could be a surprise team in the ECAC tournament. If they get hot at the right time, who knows? Number 6 is Centenary.
It's a twister! It's a twister!
The Cyclones began the season ranked 9th in my rankings and unranked in the NCEA rankings. Now, full disclosure, the NCAA folks, they can't count real well, so they don't go past 5th in their rankings for the single discipline teams at least. So that's why so many teams are unranked in their rankings. Now, with Centenary, they lost at Lynchburg and then to Charleston at a neutral site, but then they got their first win at Bridgewater. After that, they hosted Lynchburg and lost, but they beat Bridgewater the next day to end up 2-3. Now, much like Lynchburg, Centenary doesn't want anyone to know that they're going to ride again, so they have not put any of their spring meets on their own website. So I'll just take a stab in the dark and say that they lose another time or two, and they'll end the season ranked about number 7. Speaking of number 7, the 7th team in the nation is Swanee. The Tigers began the season ranked 3rd in my rankings and 4th in the NCAA rankings. They opened up with a road loss at Dartmouth and a home loss to Sweetbriar, but they upset Lynchburg at home the next day. Then they slipped up and they lost a tiebreaker at home to Bridgewater, but finished the fall strong, beating Berry both away and at home to finish 3-3 overall. The Tigers should probably be ranked ahead of Centenary right now, but other than that big Lynchburg win, all we really know about Sewanee is that they're better than Bridgewater. Now, looking ahead to the Tigers' spring schedule, I expect they're probably going to lose at Sweetbriar and at Lynchburg, but they'll win at Berry to end the regular season. And once they get in the postseason, who knows what's going to happen. Number 8 is Bridgewater. The Eagles began the season ranked 6 in my rankings. They were unranked in the NCEA rankings. They started things off with a home loss to Centenary, then at Lynchburg, and then at Centenary. So picked up a bunch of losses right out of the gate, but then they turned things around with road wins at Sewanee and at Berry. The Eagles had their best fall ever, and according to their website, they only have a home meet with Berry in the spring. Now, if that goes as expected, the Eagles could end up ranked anywhere from 6th to 8th once the regular season ends, and after that, there's the ODAC tournament, and who knows what could happen there. I'm not saying that the Eagles are going to get to Ocala, but they are already putting together their best season ever, and they might be able to get an upset or two in the ODAC tournament. We'll see. And the number 9 team is Berry. The Vikings started out the season at 6th in my ranking. They were unranked in the NCAA rankings, and it took a while before they began their NCEA season. Then they lost a pair of home meets against Bridgewater and Sewanee, and then they lost on the road to Sewanee, which we talked about earlier. Now they're going to ride against Lynchburg and Bridgewater, so we'll see if they can get a win in either of those. And then after that, they do have their conference tournament. At least I think they do. They don't have a lot on their website either. Now, I'm not sure if the Vikings can get a win in the spring, but even if they don't, I think they're building a really nice foundation for their NCEA program. Okay, so that's all of the rankings. Now, we don't have any meets to look forward to in the upcoming weeks, so with this show, I did want to mention Auburn in some way because I know so many of my listeners are Auburn fans, so I went out and I pulled stats on all the freshman riders in the sport, and I want to highlight the various freshmen out there that are making a name for themselves. Auburn has a couple, and so that's how I'm getting Auburn mentioned here, but of course, there are top freshmen just about everywhere, so they will get mentioned too. Now, these are the best I could do using my own records. It's kind of hard to find stats about these sorts of things because not everybody has them available on their website, so I have to go off my own records. So if I ended up skipping your team, it's not necessarily that they don't have any good freshmen, it's just that they didn't show up in my stats, but maybe it was a mistake on my part, or maybe they're just slow starters. But whatever the reason, here are the freshmen who are really making a name for themselves right now. And we're going to go through the dual discipline teams, and then we'll go through the single discipline teams too, and we'll go alphabetically. So first up is Auburn. Now we've got freshman Michelle Fumagalli. She rides in reining, and she has currently got a 6-1-0 record in reining. So good job to her. She also has a counterpart, Kate Haggerty, who is 3-0-0 in fences. So she's perfect right now. Hopping on over to Fresno State, Paris Mahoney is doing outstanding in both fences and flat. She's got a 6-2-0 record in fences and a 5-3-0 record on the flat. Also, her teammate Paloma Primavera is 6-1-1 in fences. Hopping across the country to Georgia, we have Tessa Downey. She has a 7-2-1 record in fences, so good job to her. Just up the road in the next state over, South Carolina, we want to highlight Amara Kettenaw, who is 3-1-0 in fences, and she is also 3-2-0 on the flat. So she's a distinguished freshman for the Gamecocks. Now jumping over to a colder part of the country, at South Dakota State, Anna Minich is 2-0-0 in horsemanship, and Emma Riggs is 3-1-0 in reining. So good job to both of those riders. Back we go to the Golden State. At UC Davis, we have Anna Donovan, who is 3-1-0 in fences. So good job to her. So those are all of the dual discipline teams. Now let's look at the single discipline teams who have some outstanding freshmen right now. First up, Berry College. Willow Rose Atkins is 2-1-0 on the flat. Over in Bridgewater, Margaret Brown is 3-1-0 on the flat, and Willow Wright is also 3-1-0 on the flat. So good job to both of them. Over we go to Dartmouth. Elise Stevens is 4-0-0 in fences, so she's perfect in the event. And then back we go to the volunteer state for Sewanee. Irene Bohm is 3-2-1 in the flat. Olivia Carmucci is 2-1-0 on the flat, and Piper Nelson Snyder is 3-1-0 in fences. All right, so that's all of our distinguished freshmen in the fall season, so good job to all those riders. And if I missed you accidentally, I'm sorry. I'm sure your parents will send me messages about that, but that's okay. It'll work itself out. We'll see how it all goes. But this is our last show of the fall season. Like I said, I hope everyone's getting all their schoolwork wrapped up and getting ready for the holidays. The season starts back up in January with some meets out in California, so we'll get things going with a spring preview near the end of January. But until then, I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Thank you very much for listening, and War Horses.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on the E2C Network. On your way out, I want to remind you to stop by e2cnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for all our content across our podcast, YouTube channel, and much more. To stay up to date with us, make sure you're following social media accounts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. While our content here may always be Auburn sports heavy, if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. War Eagle.